Our next speaker is Peter Haines, the Basin Custodian. Peter's team have been exploring how geological data and modelling can be used to identify areas across the state with potential for hydrogen, naturally occurring hydrogen. He's talking today about their hydrogen prospectivity mapping.
Just before I go on, I'll just acknowledge that this is a team effort. So there's a few other names there, and I'll particularly point out Leon Normore, who's actually heading up this particular project, but Leon can't be here today. My role is far more peripheral. Okay, so globally we produce around about 100 million tonnes of hydrogen each year, and most of that's for chemical feedstock. But in the future, it's predicted that there'll be a significant increase in demand for hydrogen, particularly as a zero carbon fuel. Now, one issue is that at the moment, almost all of the hydrogen that's produced actually comes from natural gas or coal, without any carbon capture. There is a small amount, the so-called blue hydrogen, where carbon is captured and storage, and an even smaller so-called green hydrogen, where it's produced from electrolysis using renewable energy resources. But that's also the most expensive way of making hydrogen. Now, there's been an explosion of interest in the idea of natural hydrogen, getting hydrogen from the subsurface. In the last few years, 5 years or so, there's been a huge increase in research into that, and also a significant increase in companies that are expressing an interest in exploring. However, there's only been a very small amount of actual exploration at the moment. The reason for that is that most jurisdictions around the world do not have regulations in place that actually allow you to explore for hydrogen. But that's sort of starting to change. So the map down the bottom, the world map there, which actually shows countries that actually have, at least in some jurisdiction, have hydrogen exploration permitted. Australia's on there. It's only because South Australia actually has their permitting system completely up and running, and there are a number of companies actively starting to explore there. That's what's happening in the US, Mali and South Africa, a few places in Europe. China's just appeared very, very recently. Canada, only one jurisdiction there, Saskatchewan, drilling their first well as we speak. China's just drilled their first well. Here in WA, the petroleum legislation was amended last year that in the future will allow for natural hydrogen exploration. The regulators are currently in progress of changing all the regulations to allow that to happen. So we're hoping sometime early next year that'll be a reality. The final map on the right there, that's just showing that there's clearly a bit of industry interest in WA. We've seen all these special prospecting authorities which allow you to, traditionally they're supposed to be for evaluating hydrocarbon prospectivity outside of established areas, but they're now appearing all over outside of basins, for example, in the Yilgarn, in areas where there might be hydrogen prospectivity, and a lot of these companies we know have an interest in hydrogen. A number of countries around the world are starting to look at hydrogen prospectivity of their jurisdictions, and the USGS earlier this year produced a US-wide map of hydrogen prospectivity, with the blue areas being more prospective and the sort of pale green areas being considered less prospective. And what they've done here is they've combined a whole lot of GIS data sets that are considered relevant to hydrogen prospectivity to come up with this. And if you actually look at where there's currently, or was already active hydrogen exploration happening right in the middle of, or basically along the border of Kansas and Nebraska, it's in one of those blue areas that has just been recognised as a prospective area. And that was based on targeting initially historic shows. So we're starting to look at producing a WA-wide prospectivity map. Now, the map you see there at the moment is not anywhere near a final product. It's just an example of how we could combine several different GIS layers to show areas that are more or less prospective, but don't consider that to be anywhere near a final product. So we'd be following a methodology a little bit like the mineral systems analysis. We expect there'll be, say, 20 plus predictor maps or GIS layers, each of which would be weighted in various ways. The output, we could probably make all these layers available in our WAPM's GIS layers for download. We can also include layers of like historic hydrogen shows, which I'm sort of working on, and there would obviously be some sort of explanatory report. Before I talk about some of those potential layers in a bit more detail, I'll just go through, for those who don't know, some of the aspects of the natural hydrogen system. So if we're looking first of all at sources, there's actually a large number of processes that could create hydrogen in the subsurface, but most of them are not considered economically important. The ones that are, particularly the oxidation of iron-bearing minerals, so basically iron 2+ to 3+, transformation in the presence of water. It ends up consuming oxygen and releasing hydrogen. That's probably the best way of producing a lot of hydrogen. Everyone talks about serpentinisation. That's one of those processes, but by no means the only one. Radiolysis of water. So water gets fissioned into hydrogen and oxygen during radioactive decay. Radioactive decay also produces helium, and we often see elevated helium along with natural hydrogen, and the two could be perhaps co-produced together. And on a far more local basis, there's a thermogenic process whereby organic matter buried in deep sub-basins that gets matured beyond the gas window can start producing hydrogen. And finally, there's no doubt there's hydrogen deep in the earth, in the core and mantle. It's a bit controversial as to how much of that actually makes it up into the crust. But some consider that's a significant component. Migration of hydrogen, this can be quite complicated because hydrogen moves upwards by diffusion, but it also moves by advection in water. The solubility of hydrogen in water goes up significantly with increased temperature and pressure, so hydrogen is often in solution deeper down in the crust, and there's importance of faulting and fracturing and getting hydrogen up to shallow depths. It's quite difficult to trap. It's a lot harder to trap than hydrocarbons. So the question is whether we should be looking for accumulations like similar to hydrocarbon systems. And certainly if you look at it from the point of view of a petroleum geologist, you'd be looking at, well, it might be sourced in the basement, but we'd be looking at traps in overlying sedimentary basins. There's another viewpoint that perhaps we should be because it's so hard to trap, we should be perhaps looking at targeting active fluxes in fault systems and things like that. The place you could perhaps trap salt in a basin would be where we've got a perfect seal like salt. I'll move on now to perhaps just some examples of these possible predictor maps. So if we're looking at sources, we'd be looking at things like where there are mafic and ultramafic rocks. We could use geophysical proxies to determine where they are deeper down in the crust. Radiolysis would be mapping things like young granites and cratonic areas with higher radiogenesis. Deep sources would be looking at major crustal boundaries. Thermogenesis, you'd be mapping deep basin depot centres. Heat flow is important. Not as a source, but it affects various ones of those. Migration pathways, again, we'll be looking at major crustal boundaries and deep faults. Sedimentary basins for moving things laterally by advection. Reservoirs, well, if you're interested in sedimentary style reservoirs, you'd be mapping sedimentary versus non-sedimentary areas. And for seals, we'd be mapping things like subsurface salts in basins, etc. We could add in historic shows. This is something I'm working on. I've talked about this in previous open days, so I won't progress any further with that at the moment, but this is work in progress on all the historic shows. So I'll go to my summary there. The regulations permitting hydrogen exploration in WA are in progress, hopefully coming soon. We think WA is prospective for natural hydrogen. There's clear interest from industry, and we're in the progress of producing a statewide prospectivity map. So I'll leave it there.